Greetings and welcome. We are in Senior English A, and our objective now for the day is to introduce one of the greatest writers of the English language, John Milton. Now, some of you will say, dude, you keep saying this about every one of the guys we're studying, that they're one of the greatest. Well, yeah, that's kind of the point of a lit course. You kind of pick the most important, the representative voices, and you say, okay, this is an important writer. But what happens when you ask the most important voices in the literature of England who they consider to be the greatest? So, for example, when you ask John Keats, who do you think's the greatest poet of all time? They will always give you two names. When you ask Wordsworth, always give you the same two names. And on and on and on, the list will go. Those two names are always the same in the English language. The first is always who? Yeah, Shakespeare. That's always an easy one. And then the second one is John Milton. So let's talk about who this Milton cat is and why he's such an important figure in English history. Two important answers. One, Milton is going to provide us with an important epic poem. Okay? He wants to write a very important poem. And because of that, he will write the most famous poem in the English language that we call an epic poem. And that's what we call Paradise Lost. Paradise Lost. I'll obviously have more to say about this in a second. I'm just giving you some setup. Okay. Number two, Milton is a phenom. He is the best of the best intellectually. He ranks right up there with Francis Bacon in terms of brilliance. But he outdoes Bacon in a number of ways that we'll talk about. Now, these two things kind of come together. All right, they kind of go together. So let's talk about them. And the place you have to start with Milton is his biography. Who is this guy? Well, I can't get into a lot of detail because I don't have a lot of time. But let's just say it this way. He, like Bacon, is stinking brilliant. His daddy has money. And so what his daddy does, two things that basically changes the world of literature forever. His daddy goes out and he buys books. There's a belief that his father owns and has in his library all of the major books of the known day. Now, that's not like saying all the books of today. We have literally billions of books today printed. But in 1650, you don't have that many books. I mean, you got thousands of books, but you don't have that many books. Apparently, John Milton's father, he has most of these books in the original languages. Two, he goes out and he gets his boy the best teachers he can find him. And Milton, John Milton, the young boy, he is a prodigy from a very young age. He picks up languages very, very quickly. And he has an unbelievable memory. Got me? So in other words, think about it this way. Let's just stick with the last 4 years of English class. Let's just imagine for a moment that no matter what you've read, I don't care how much of it you've read, whether you read just a little bit or a bunch, imagine if you could remember all of it. All of it. What you've read since you were a freshman. So, for example, if I were to say to you, most dangerous game, immediately it would call up in your memory your freshman year about some cat that runs around on an island trying not to get shot. But wait a minute, Keely, you're missing my point here. If I say it to Milton, most dangerous game, when he's 12, he'll start reciting the opening lines of the story. Word for stinking word. That's what I mean. Yeah, that's what I mean. That's the kind of mind I'm talking about. People argued he had what we would later call a photographic memory. That he could look at material and he could somehow remember it long after the fact. I'm not done. He reads his father's library in the original languages. We were talking about the 1611 King James Version of the Bible. For you to read that Bible in translation means you know how to read English. But what if you wanted to read the Bible in the original language? You'd have to know Hebrew, Greek, and a little bit of another language that we believe Jesus Christ spoke called Aramaic. Those three languages are necessary to read the Bible in any kind of original language. Milton read in Hebrew and Greek. They played games with him where they would open the Bible at random, start reading a single verse from the Bible, and he would start quoting from that verse going forwards or backwards. That's the kind of memory that he's got. But he's not content. He doesn't think he's knowledgeable enough. So then he starts his traveling tour. And this becomes kind of like the thing that all kids going forward will do. If you're raised in a home where you've got wealth, you get to a certain age and then you go on a world tour, which ostensibly in Milton's day meant Europe. Okay, you go across the channel to the mainland and the continent and you go all over and you visit. While he's visiting, he's meeting people and he's reading. And then he comes back and he sits down for 6 years and he reads every book in his dad's library. Now, I'm serious. He reads all of the books in his dad's library. There are people who believe that by the time he gets ready to write Paradise Lost, he's read every known book in Europe, in the original language, and he can remember this stuff. He not only just reads it, he remembers it. And then he starts going blind. See, this gets more interesting. I told you his biography is fascinating. He starts losing his sight. Now, part of this may have to do with the fact he was reading 16 hours a day, much of it by candlelight. Remember, you got no overhead lights in Milton's day. And so he's sitting in a room that is predominantly dark, reading by candlelight, straining his eyes over a period of years. He begins to go blind, and then he invents the idea of his famous epic poem called Paradise Lost. By the time he gets around to writing Paradise Lost, the chap is blind. So what does he do? He recites the poem out loud to his daughters who are writing it down, what we call an amanuensis or a secretary. They're writing the words down. So Mr. Keeley, Milton will recite out loud the lines of his poem that he's making in his mind. I'm not done. When in a famous book of Paradise Lost, sin shows up for the first time. It shows up at line number 666. Nobody told Milton he was at line 666, but he knew. That's the kind of mind I'm talking about. All right, do you got me? So in other words, when we talk about a mind like this, we're saying, okay, guys like this don't come along very often. Right, that's right. Which is why John Keats will say in his diaries, no matter what I write, I'll never be a real poet because there ain't but two of them, and it's Shakespeare and Milton. So here we are now with Milton. Let's talk a little bit about this guy and what makes him now so significantly important in terms of his literary texts. It's not just his life that's remarkable, it's the stuff he produced in his life. And namely, of course, that famous epic called Paradise Lost. But before we get there, you have a couple of sonnets. He was a great sonneteer. He loved writing sonnets. You have a couple of sonnets which will give us some insight into this kid's mindset. I'm with you now on page 482. I can't spend as much time with these poems as I would like, but we'll go ahead at least and introduce a bit to you. How Soon Hath Time is the title of this little ditty. Take a look at it with me and tell me if you can get any sense of what he's saying. I'll give you a hint. He wrote this when he was young. He wrote this when he was in his early 20s. He wrote this when he was your age. Take a look. How soon hath time, the subtle thief of youth, stolen on his wing my 23 year. Put it in your own words. I'm 23 years old. I'm an old man. That's his view. I'm an old man. I'm 23 years old. I'll give you a hint for this one. I'm 23 years old and I haven't done anything yet. It would be like some kid today saying, I'm 23 years old and I haven't made my first 10 million. What's wrong with me? I am a failure. I haven't made my first 10 million yet. I know that other people at a very young age have made their millions through writing software or whatever. What's wrong with me? I'm a complete and total failure. I haven't made my first 10 million yet. I haven't written a software program that lands me on Fortune's list of top 500 people of wealth in the world. What's wrong with me? I'm 23 years old. I'm already getting old. Most of us don't think in this way, do we? At 23, we're normally still trying to figure out how we can stay young and maybe even a little bit naive and ignorant or stupid about the world. Milton, let's just say it this way, he's very ambitious. He puts a lot of pressure on himself. Keep reading. My hastening days fly on with full career. I'm getting old. But my late spring no butter blossom showeth. I got nothing to show. He wants to be a famous writer. Perhaps my semblance might deceive the truth that I to manhood am arrived so near, and inward ripeness doth much less appear, that some more timely happy spirits endureth. Other people are getting famous. Other people are making a name for themselves. I'm not. I'm a total loser. Yet be it less or more or soon or slow, it shall be strict and still in strictest measure even to the same lot, however mean or high, towards which time leads me in the will of heaven. All is, if I have grace to use it so, as ever in my great taskmaster's eye. I didn't say this out loud, probably assumed. Milton, a devout Christian. In the 1611 King James Version of the Bible, there's an intriguing story about a father who leaves his sons, 3 boys, each of them with a different amount of wealth. One he gives $1,000 to. Another he gives $500 to. And the youngest of the 3 boys, he gives $25. And then he leaves and he goes away. When he comes back, he's interested in asking his boys, what'd you do with the currency? The boy who was oldest, who was given the most wealth, has come back and he's turned it into several $100,000. He's invested it. He's used it. The second boy, he asks. Sure enough, this boy also took his talents. That's the old-fashioned word for money. In 1611, talents were called money, coinage. And he used his talents. The third boy, he won't look at his daddy in the eye. He's kind of looking down. What's going on, boy? Talk to me. And the kid says, well, you only gave me $25, and I was like really worried I was going to like lose it or something, so I just put it in a hole in the ground and buried it. But look, I got it. I didn't lose the 25 bones. And we're told that the dad says to him, you're a total loser. I left my other 2 boys with money. They made it more money. They invested their talent. They used their talent. Of course, later the word talent will come to mean ability. So that by the time you, of course, are being raised in your home, you've probably heard this notion that if you're given some ability or talent, you have a need to use that talent and not let it waste. Milton knew that story, and he knew it well. He writes a poem at 23 where he says, I got all this talent, but I haven't produced anything, and God is watching doing one of these from heaven. Waiting, just waiting. Serious pressure on him. Look at our second poem. This one is written, well, guess with me. You can see the title. Can you guess when he writes this poem? When I consider how my light is spent. Yeah, this is when he's barely able to see anymore. These are some of the last words he physically will ever see in his life, which gives some sense of drama to these lines. Take a look at this one. Think about it. You have all of this pressure on you to produce something because you know you're talented, and then all of a sudden, because you're a reader and a writer, all of a sudden you start going blind. Look at what he says. When I consider how my light is spent, ere half my days in this dark world and wide, and that one talent which is death to hide lodged in me, useless, though my soul more bent to serve there with my Maker and present my true account, lest he returning chide, God comes back and asks him, doth God exact day labor light denied? He imagines that if he were to die after he goes blind and go visit God, God would say, what? Just because you lost your sight, you think I give up on you? You still got to go to work. You still have to produce something important. Milton is writing this poem to himself to say, you've got to do something before you die. By the time he's writing this poem, Milton is already considered one of the greatest poets alive. And he still thinks of himself as a loser. He hasn't done enough yet. Right? Maybe you know somebody like this. They're always pushing. They're always pushing. It's never enough. When they hear people say good enough, they say, I don't even know what that means. What do you mean good enough? It's never good enough until it's the best. You know, that kind of thing. That's Milton. I finally ask, but patience, to prevent that murmur, soon replies. Patience speaks back to him. God doth not need either man's work or his own gifts. Who best bear his mild yoke, they serve him best. His state is kingly. thousands at his bidding, speed and post o'er land or ocean without rest. They also serve who only stand and wait. At the end of this sonnet, Milton tells himself, patience, patience. It's all a matter of time. Don't worry, you'll get there. Well, getting there comes in the form of what we will call Paradise Lost. Go ahead and turn the page, and now we're set up for Paradise Lost. I'm on page 486 now with you. Now, what is this story? Well, let me give you a schemata. Tomorrow we'll listen to it, but today we'll just talk about it. What is the story? Well, Milton was a reader of the Bible. The Judeo-Christian text begins with the book of Genesis. The book of Genesis begins in chapter 1 with the creation of the world. The creation of the world is followed in chapter 2 and 3 by the creation of two people, a man named Adam and a woman named Eve. In the third chapter of Genesis, and you may want to write that down at 3a and go back and look at it on your own sometime when you have one of these books in your hand called the Bible. In Genesis chapter 3, we're told a very interesting, a very brief, short story. The story runs something like this. Adam and Eve were placed in a special garden called Eden. Into that garden comes a talking snake. That snake finds Eve alone. That snake says to Eve, so you live in this garden, so can you eat anything in the garden? And Eve will say, yeah, except for one tree in the garden. Really? The snake asks, what tree? Well, it's a special tree called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, a strangely named tree. Eve tells the snake, if I eat from that tree, me and Adam, we have been told that we will die. The snake says back, it's a total myth. You won't die at all. As a matter of fact, if you eat from that tree, you will actually become like God who created you in this garden. Go ahead, eat from the tree. Eve does eat from the tree. She gives to Adam and he also eats from the tree. And immediately they discover that they are naked. They weren't wearing any clothes before, but it didn't matter to them. And then all of a sudden they feel shame, we're told. Then we're told that God comes along for a little walk in the late afternoon, and they hide. They hide from God. They're ashamed and they hide. God, in the process, we're told in this brief story then, will condemn or curse all three of the players of our story. First, the serpent, we're told, the snake, has to, for the rest of his life, crawl around on his belly. The woman, we're told, is cursed in having to have pain when she gives birth to children. Remember, she's the first woman, so she's not yet given birth to a child. When she gives birth to children, she will have pain. Adam is cursed, are you ready for this? Because he listened to his wife. That's what it says, Genesis 3. He's cursed because he listened to... He's not cursed for eating from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. He's cursed for listening to his wife Eve, and for that, he is cursed with having to work with his hands and labor in the soil, and it's hard work. In other words, he'll have to work for a living and it's going to be rough. Then, the story ends with Adam and Eve being thrown out of the garden. End of story. Milton comes along and he says, this is an intriguing story. I want to write a poem about it. The poem that he writes is called Paradise Lost, which makes sense now that I tell you the story, right? You could have simply called it Eden Lost. That is to say, you're living in this perfect place called paradise. You eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and for that you get tossed out of the garden. But wait a minute, there's one intriguing part of the story, and that is this serpent. Who is this serpent? Well, if you read Genesis 3, there is no answer to that question. The serpent, or the snake, is a snake. By the time Milton writes Paradise Lost, the snake is Satan. Satan has been thrown out of heaven along with his angels. The reason is simple. Satan did not want to bow before God, worship God. So he's thrown out of heaven into hell. Pandemonium is created, and in hell, Satan discovers a plan. I know how to jack God back. The way I'll do it is to sneak into a new paradise, Eden, that's just been created, and I'll convince Eve to eat of a special tree in that garden she's not supposed to eat from. And Adam will also eat. Satan in Milton's myth, Satan will fly through the abyss upwards towards paradise. He will enter paradise through the form of a snake, where he will have a conversation with Eve when she is alone, not with Adam, and he will convince Eve to eat from this tree. She does it. Adam, in Milton's story, Adam is in love with Eve. She's really hot. And he doesn't want to lose his girl. And he realizes she's jacked the minute she's eaten from the tree. He also will eat from the tree because he wants to be with his girl. Then, of course, right, they are thrown out of the garden at the end of our story. Milton will take some 26 lines of biblical text and turn it into remarkable poetry of thousands and thousands of lines of poetry. Now, what your textbook does to try to introduce you to Paradise Lost is to give you just the opening lines of the first book. I'm with you on page 486. It will make sense now that I've introduced this to you. And by the way, I'm going to work right up until the bell rings, simply by virtue of the fact I'm not going to see a number of you tomorrow. The opening lines of this epic are what we call the invocation of the muse. In other words, the poet will ask God to give him inspiration. Take a look at the opening lines, and it will make total sense now that you know the backstory. Of man's first disobedience. What disobedience? Eating of a forbidden tree. And the fruit of that forbidden tree, whose mortal taste brought death into the world. Uh-oh, I failed to mention that part. Milton tells this story to explain why little 5-year-old girls die of cancer. Do you know what I'm saying about that? So, for example, a little girl is dying in the hospital room, and you walk into the hospital room. The obvious question, if you're the mom, is, why? Why does my kid have to die of cancer? Like, why? Milton's answer is a simple one. Adam and Eve ate that fruit in the Garden of Eden, and that brought death into the world. They would have lived forever if they had not disobeyed God. This is Milton's view. That's what he means by brought death into the world. And all our woe with loss of Eden. There it is, Paradise Lost, right? Till one greater man, this is the continuation of Milton's Christian theology. The only way humans can be saved is for the Son of God, Jesus Christ, in Christian theology, to leave heaven, to come to earth, where he, of course, has to be sacrificed in the form of a cross, and then ultimately, as he says here, restore us and regain the blissful seat. In other words, this is Milton's attempt to try to explain two things. One, why bad things happen in the world, and two, how good things can happen in the world. Okay, so this is kind of Milton's view. He will call it justifying the ways of God to men. Now, we have a word for this. It's called theodicy. Write it down. T-H-E-O-D-I-C-Y. T-H-E-O-D-I-C-Y. Theodicy. Now, watch my whiteboard for a second. It goes like this. You put a triangle on your paper. Go ahead and do this with me now. At the top, you put all loving God. At another corner, you put all-powerful God. And then over here, you put bad stuff or pain. Now, follow the argument. You go into the room where the 5-year-old's dying of leukemia, and you walk up to the mom and you say, it's really sad your kid's dying of leukemia. And the mom says, well, clearly there's no God. And you say, no, no, no. God is all-loving. God totally loves your daughter. What? What are you talking about, God? My daughter is dying of cancer. Well, if God loves my daughter, he must not be strong enough to fix my daughter. Oh, no, no, no. God is totally all-powerful. God can fix the cancer in your daughter. God can fix the cancer in my daughter, but doesn't? God must not be very loving. Oh, no, no, no. God is totally all-loving, but also totally all-powerful. The theodicy question, T-H-E-O-D-I-C-Y, asks a simple question. How can you explain the existence of bad stuff in a world supposedly created by an all-loving and all-powerful deity? How do you explain that fact? Because one of those three things is absolutely certain. That kid's dying of cancer, agreed? The obvious question is, how come? Why would God allow it? That's the theodicy question. Milton will seek to answer or justify the ways of God to men by saying it comes down to one simple phrase: free will. Now, this is not a phrase that you will read in the 1611 King James Version of the Bible, but it is an important term for Milton. Sometimes the word agency gets used. Free will or free choice or agency all means the same thing. Human beings placed in a garden to have freedom, true freedom, have to be able to choose what they can do. Either eat from the tree or not eat from the tree. Human beings chose, and because they chose, all the rest of us are basically stuck with that choice. That's Milton's theodicy. Now, whether it works or not for you is a whole different project. Tomorrow when you come back, we will, and for those of you not here, you'll watch on video, we'll look at the very first book of Paradise Lost, and more particularly at the character called Satan, who Milton enjoys creating with some panache, we might say. Thank you. Come back tomorrow.